What if one morning you wake up and the first notification on your phone says, China launches missiles toward Taiwan? No warning, no countdown, just panic. Within minutes, global markets crash as warships move, airspace shuts down, and suddenly the world asks one terrifying question. Is this the beginning of World War III? What do it matter? Taiwan is not just an island. It is the most dangerous flashpoint on Earth. Officially, China claims Taiwan is its own territory. Taiwan says it is already independent. The United States says it will help Taiwan defend itself. That one sentence is why this war could explode globally. Taiwan controls over 60% of the world's advanced microchips. Every iPhone missile system, AI server, and fighter jet depends on them. If China controls Taiwan, China controls the future of technology. And America knows it, the Silicon Shield. As you noted, Taiwan produces over 60% of the world's semiconductors and roughly 90% of the most advanced chips, those below 7 nanometers. The golden screw economists call these chips the golden screw of the global economy. Without them, production lines for cars, medical devices, and weapon systems across the globe would simply stop. The $10 trillion price tag Bloomberg Economics estimates a conflict over Taiwan could cost the global economy $10 trillion, about 10% of global GDP. That's a bigger hit than the 2008 financial crisis. The COVID-19 pandemic and the Ukraine war combined to strategic ambiguity versus sudden clarity. For decades, the US has maintained the policy of strategic ambiguity, refusing to say definitely whether it would intervene. The goal deterred China from invading, but also deterred Taiwan from declaring formal independence. The shift in recent years that ambiguity has worn thin. Official statements and sacred commitments have signaled that the US views Taiwan's security as a vital national interest, not just diplomatic preference. 3. The unsinkable aircraft carrier. Beyond chips, Taiwan is prime real estate. General Douglas MacArthur once called it an unsinkable aircraft carrier. If China controls Taiwan, it breaks through the first island chain, giving the Chinese Navy direct, unhindered access to the deep waters of the Pacific. This would fundamentally shift the balance of power, putting its bases in Guam and Hawaii, and allies like Japan and the Philippines, in a much more vulnerable position. 4. A collision of ideologies. This isn't just a trade war, it's a battle over the status quo. China's perspective, this is the final chapter of the Chinese Civil War and a matter of national rejuvenation. The West's perspective, it is the ultimate test of the rules-based international order. If Taiwan falls by force, the message to the rest of the world is that might makes right. The bottom line, if the notification from your first prompt ever became reality, it wouldn't just be a regional war, it would be a tectonic shift in human history, redefining who leads the world and how we use technology for the next century. The Silicon Shield, the hardware. Modern civilization is built on a foundation of silicon. Taiwan, specifically a company called SimChi, Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, is the world's only source for the most advanced chips. The monopoly, these aren't the simple chips in your microwave. These are the 3 nanometers and 5 nanometers processors that power generative AI, F-35 fighter jets, and the servers that run global finance. Why it prevents and causes war, this is the Silicon Shield. China depends on these chips just as much as the US does. If the factories are destroyed in a war, China's own tech industry collapses. However, if China captures them intact, they gain a generational lead over the West. The first island chain, the geography. Military strategists look at the Pacific like a chessboard. The barrier, Taiwan, is the central link in a chain of islands, including Japan and the Philippines, that prevents the Chinese Navy from easily entering the deep Pacific. The breakout if China controls Taiwan. Their submarines and aircraft carriers have a doorway to the open ocean. This would make it much harder for the US to protect allies like Hawaii, Guam, or Australia. China's motive. China doesn't want war, but it wants control. President Xi Jinping has openly said, reunification with Taiwan is inevitable. For China, Taiwan is this national pride, military positioning, economic dominance. China has spent years preparing massive naval expansion, hypersonic missiles, cyber warfare units, space warfare tech. This is not theory. This is preparation. The strategic linchpin. For President Xi, Taiwan isn't just an island. It is the final piece of the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. National pride is the last unresolved chapter of the Chinese Civil War. To the CCP, a separate Taiwan is a constant reminder of past colonial interference. Military positioning Taiwan sits at the center of the first island chain. If China controls it, they can project power directly into the deep Pacific, effectively breaking the US naval perimeter that has contained them since the 1950s. Economic dominance and the Silicon Shield. You mentioned economic dominance, and the stakes there are absolute. Semiconductors. Taiwan produces over 60% of the world's semiconductors and over 90% of the most advanced chips. The leverage controlling this supply chain wouldn't just fuel China's AI and military tech. It would give Beijing a kill switch over the global economy. From theory to reality 2025-2026. The preparation you noted has reached a fever pitch recently. Naval expansion. The planned People's Liberation Army Navy is now the largest navy in the world by hull count. In late 2025, they successfully tested the YJ-20 on new ship launched hypersonic anti-ship missile design specifically to keep us carriers at bay. The unstoppable narrative. In his New Year 2026 address, Xi Jinping upgraded his rhetoric, calling reunification unstoppable and formalizing Taiwan Recovery Day. Gray's own tactics. We aren't just seeing missile tests anymore. We are seeing just this mission to 1,025 inches style rules massive. Live fire blockades that simulate strangling the island without firing a shot at the shore. The reality check. While the preparation is undeniable, the doesn't want war part is the ultimate gamble. China prefers winning without fighting, using overwhelming pressure to force a political surrender. However, the risk of a miscalculation during these drills is at an all-time high. The historical mode of the Great Rejuvenation. For the Chinese Communist Party CCP, Taiwan is the last missing piece of the Chinese dream. Legacy. President Xi has tied reunification to his personal legacy. In his January 1st, 2026 New Year address, he explicitly called reunification unstoppable and highlighted the 2025 institution of Taiwan Recovery Day to cement the island's identity as Chinese territory. The 2027 headline US and Taiwanese intelligence 2027, the 100th anniversary of the plot, the target date by which she wants his military to have the capability to take the island, regardless of whether he pulls the trigger. To military preparation. Winning without fighting. China's military strategy isn't just about an invasion. It's about making Taiwan's defense look so impossible that they surrender. The naval wall. China now operates the world's largest navy. In late 2025, they launched the Type 076, a massive landing ship capable of deploying swarms of attack drones and helicopters, specifically designed for amphibious assault. Hypersonic carrier killers. The DF-17 and the newer YJ-20 missiles are designed to create an ozone for us aircraft carriers. By demonstrating these in the Justice Mission 2025 inches drills, China is telling the US to stay out, or you will lose your fleet. Space and cyber warfare. In 2025, Taiwan saw an average of 2.63 million cyber attacks per day. These aren't just for data, they are probes to find the off switches for Taiwan's power grid, banks, and hospitals in the event of a conflict. How the war could start? This war will not start with a declaration. It will start with cyber attacks shutting down Taiwan's power grid, GPS disruptions, communication blackouts. Then comes the blockade. China surrounds Taiwan with warships. No food, no oil, no internet. If Taiwan resists, missiles follow. The world watches in silence. The invisible opening cyber and electronic warfare. Before a single shot is fired, the goal is to induce strategic paralysis. Grid collapse by targeting the SCADA systems that control Taiwan's power and water. An aggressor could create domestic chaos, making it nearly impossible for the government to coordinate a civil or military response. Information isolation, severing undersea fiber optic cables. Taiwan is linked by roughly 15 of them, would instantly cut the island off from the global internet, while GPS jamming would blind both commercial shipping and local defense systems. 2. The Anaconda strategy, the blockade. As you noted, a blockade or quarantine is the ultimate leverage. The energy hooked Taiwan imports roughly 97% of its energy. It typically maintains only about 8-10 days of liquefied natural gas LNG reserves. If tankers can't dock, the lights go out permanently within 2 weeks. The global shock: this wouldn't happen in silence for long, because Taiwan produces over 90% of the world's most advanced semiconductors. A blockade would trigger an immediate global economic depression. Every smartphone, car, medical device factory on Earth would feel the impact within days. 3. The silent world. The most haunting part of your scenario is the world watching in silence. Historically, blockades are legally considered an act of war. But quarantines like the 1960 Cuban Missile Crisis occupy legal gray area. The dilemma for the US and its allies: breaking a blockade means being the ones to fire the first shot to escort a cargo ship. The deterrent: currently, the presence of foreign freedom of navigation transits in the Taiwan Strait by the US, UK, Canada, and others is the main signal that the world does not intend to watch in silence. For the brink from blockade to kinetic war. If the blockade doesn't force a surrender, the transition to missiles is the final, devastating step. Modern simulations like those from CC suggest that this stage would result in staggering losses for all sides involved, potentially dragging the entire Pacific region into a multi-year conflict. The seed: near naval mines. The most cost-effective way to break a blockade is to make the surrounding waters impassable for the blockading fleet. Rapid mine layers. Taiwan has commissioned Minjong-class mine-laying ships. These can saturate the shallow waters of the Taiwan Strait with thousands of smart mines in hours. The goal: by mining its own ports in the narrow choke points around the island, Taiwan forces Chinese warships to stay further out at sea. This creates safe corridors where supply ships from allies like the US or Japan could potentially slip through. The Ghost Fleet, fast missile corvettes. If China surrounds the island with massive destroyers and aircraft carriers, Taiwan responds with mosquito tactics. Cheng-class corvettes: these are small, high-speed catamarans with stealth coatings. They carry a massive punch, up to 16 anti-ship missiles, but are very hard to track on radar. Hit and run in a blockade: these ships hide in small fishing ports or along the rocky coastline, darting out to fire supersonic Shi-Fang E missiles, carrier killers, before vanishing back into the noise of the coast. Mobile kills: owns land-based missiles. A blockade requires ships to stay relatively stationary to patrol and intercept traffic. This makes them sitting ducks for Taiwan's mobile truck-mounted launchers. HIMARS and harpoons. Taiwan has significantly increased its inventory of mobile harpoon missiles and HIMARS, high-mobility artillery. Where the USA enters, America cannot ignore Taiwan. Why? Because if Taiwan falls, us allies lose trust. China becomes the dominant Pacific power. US military bases in Japan and Guam are threatened. The US response would likely include aircraft carriers near Taiwan, sanctions on China, intelligence and weapons support. But one missile hits a ship, and the war officially begins. Why the US cannot ignore Taiwan? Beyond the emotional or democratic ties, the strategic math is cold and clear. The first island chain, Taiwan, is the central link in a chain of islands from Japan to the Philippines that prevents the Chinese Navy from having blue water access to the deep Pacific. If Taiwan falls, China can project power directly toward Hawaii and the US West Coast. The silicon shield Taiwan produces over 60% of the world's semiconductors and roughly 90% of the most advanced chips. If that production is halted or seized, the global economy and the US military industrial base effectively freezes. Ally credibility: if the US fails to defend Taiwan, allies like Japan, South Korea, and the Philippines may decide the US security umbrella is broken and either arm themselves with nuclear weapons or align with Beijing to survive. The tripwire reality. You mentioned a missile hitting a ship. This is the nightmare scenario known as a kinetic escalation. Here is how that war officially begins. Logic usually plays out in strategic simulations. The strategic ambiguity factor. The US currently operates under a policy of strategic ambiguity. They don't explicitly say they will defend Taiwan, but they don't say they won't. The goal is to keep China guessing about the cost of an attack while keeping Taiwan from declaring formal independence. Note, while it feels like a one-missile trigger, modern doctrine suggests the US and China would both try to keep the conflict conventional. The moment a ship is hit, the world enters a great power conflict for the first time since the first island chain military geography. Think of the Pacific Ocean as a massive house. Currently, the US and its allies hold the front door, the first island chain, which runs from Japan through Taiwan down to the Philippines. The bottleneck: as long as Taiwan is allied with the West, China's navy is hemmed in. Their submarines can be tracked the moment they leave port because they have to pass through narrow, monitored straits. The breakout: if China takes Taiwan, they gain deep water ports. This allows Chinese nuclear submarines to disappear into the deep Pacific undetected, putting the US West Coast in permanent, direct range of underwater missile launches. 2. The AI and tech heartbeat: economic survival. In 2026, the global economy isn't run on oil as much as it is run on advanced logic chips. Semchi, one company in Taiwan, Semchi produces nearly 90% of the world's most advanced semiconductors. The impact: if a war stops production, the world doesn't just lose iPhones. We lose the ability to build medical devices, cars, refrigerators, and, crucially, the precision-guided missiles the US military needs to fight back. The silicon shield: Taiwan's dominance in chips is so absolute that some call it a shield. China might hesitate to destroy the very factories it needs for its own economy, and the US is forced to protect the source of its technological lifeblood. The credibility trap: global alliances. The US has spent 80 years telling countries like Japan, South Korea, and the Philippines, stay with us and we will protect you. The trust fall: if the US lets Taiwan fall, every other ally will wonder if they are next. This could lead to a scramble where Japan or South Korea build their own nuclear weapons to feel safe, or they might flip their allegiance to China to avoid being invaded. The new reality under the 2026 US National Defense Strategy. The US is shifting toward integrated deterrence. Japan, NATO, and global chaos. Japan is only miles away. Spaces: there would be immediate targets. If Japan is attacked, America is obligated to respond. NATO may not send troops, but economically the world splits in two. Global trade collapses. Oil prices explode. Supply chains die overnight. This would not be a regional war. This would be system failure. The Indo-Pacific tripwire. Japan isn't just an ally, it is the cornerstone of US power projection in Asia. As you noted, the US-Japan Security Treaty Article 5 is ironclad, but proximity with major bases in Okinawa and Yosaku. The US military presence is embedded in Japanese soil. An attack on Japan is by physical necessity an attack on US forces. The NATO complication, while NATO's Article 5 is geographically limited to the North Atlantic, a conflict involving the US and Japan would likely trigger Article 4 consultations, pulling European allies into the economic and logistical fray even if they don't send boots on the ground. 2. The economic great fracture. If the Pacific becomes a no-go zone, the world splits into isn't hyperbole, it's a mathematical certainty. The Tsen-Chi factor, while located in Taiwan. The proximity to Japan means the Silicon Shield would be under direct threat. Losing high-end semiconductors would halt the production of everything from iPhones to F-35s. Energy choke points, oil prices wouldn't just rise. They would teleport to new highs as the South China Sea and the Sea of Japan arteries for global energy become combat zones. 3. Supply chain cardiac arrest. We saw a preview of this during the 2022 period, but a conflict in Japan would be far worse. Just-in-time logistics, the global economy runs on just-in-time delivery. In a conflict that shifts to not-in-time trade blockades, we would see the immediate emergence of two distinct trade blocks, a Western and bloc and an adversarial bloc, with neutral nations forced to make impossible, ruinous choices. The legal automatic pilot as Japan treaty. Unlike many alliances that are consultative, the US-Japan Security Treaty Article 5 is a direct commitment. Immediate targets, because the US 7th Fleet is headquartered in Yosaku and the 5th Air Force is in Yokota. Any strike on Japanese territory is physically inseparable from a strike on the US military. No room for neutrality for the US. Ignoring an attack on Japan would mean the immediate end of every other American alliance, NATO, South Korea, Australia. It would be the end of the American century overnight. Therefore, the response is viewed by the Pentagon as mandatory, not optional. 2. The economic heart attack. Japan is the world's fourth largest economy, but its importance is more about what it makes than how much it spends. The intermediate trap, Japan doesn't just export cars, it exports the high-tech chemicals, specialized machinery, and precision parts that other countries, like China and the US, need to build their own products. The result, if Japan's ports close, factories in Germany, Mexico, and the US stop within weeks because they lack the specific Japanese-made sensors or materials that have no substitute. This is the supply chain cardiac arrest you alluded to. 3. The maritime choke points, the Malacca dilemma. Japan's, it's at the top of the first island chain. A war here effectively puts a padlock on the Pacific. Energy flow, 80% of China's oil and 90% of Japan's energy passes through the South China Sea and the Strait of Malacca. The two worlds split if the Sea of Japan and the East China Sea become a war zone. Global insurance companies will stop covering commercial ships in the region. Trade doesn't just slow down, it stops. Inflation, you mentioned, oil prices exploding. In this scenario, we aren't talking about $100/barrel. Analysts fear a total lack of liquidity where prices become irrelevant because the physical supply is cut off. Nuclear question. Will nuclear weapons be used? Unlikely at first. But history shows one pattern. Wars escalate faster than leaders expect. A single miscalculation, a misunderstood radar signal, and the unthinkable becomes reality. The anatomy of the unthinkable. History suggests that if the nuclear taboos are ever broken, it would likely stem from one of three catalysts. The use it or lose it dilemma. If a nation believes its own nuclear arsenal or command structure is about to be destroyed by conventional means. They may feel pressured to launch before they lose the capability to do so. Tactical normalization, the risk increases if leaders believe they can use a small, low-yield tactical weapon to end a local conflict without triggering a global exchange. History shows that once the first shot is fired, the rules of war vanish. The fog of data, as you mentioned, a misunderstood radar signal is a classic nightmare. During the Cold War, we came within minutes of total war multiple times, most notably in 1983 when Stanislav Petrov correctly guessed that a Soviet satellite warning of an incoming strike was a technical glitch. The death of arms control February 2026. We are at a historic inflection point. The New START Treaty, the last remaining agreement limiting the nuclear arsenals of the US and Russia, is set to expire on February 5, 2026. The consequence, for the first time since the 1970s, there will be no legally binding limits or inspections on the world's two largest nuclear stockpiles. The result, transparency drops, and the miscalculation you mentioned becomes much more likely because leaders are now guessing about each other's capabilities instead of verifying them. 2. The fog of data and AI. You mentioned the misunderstood radar signal. In 2026, that risk is being compounded by artificial intelligence. The speed problem, military systems are integrating AI to process threats in milliseconds. If an AI detects a potential launch, it may pressure human leaders to use it or lose it before they've even had time to pick up a phone. Cyber vulnerability. Strategic analysts are increasingly worried that a cyber attack could spoof a launch signal or disable a nation's command and control in C3, making a panicked response the default setting. 3. The current doomsday outlook. In January 2026, the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists moved the doomsday clock to 85 seconds to midnight, the closest it has ever been in history. They cited the ongoing war in Ukraine now in its fifth year and threats to nuclear power plants like Zaporizhzhia Haifa, the expansion of China's nuclear arsenal, the risk of a nuclear domino effect in East Asia as nations like South Korea reconsider their own nuclear paths. The reality check. While the unthinkable feels closer, the logic of mutually assured destruction mad still holds weight. No leader wins a nuclear war. They only decide how they want to lose. The danger today isn't a lack of fear, it's the loss of communication channels that allow leaders to de-escalate once the ladder climbing begins. Important note: in 2026, the global focus is shifting toward the NPT review conference April. This is seen as the last chance for the international community to reestablish rules before a new, unrestrained arms race begins. Who really wins? There are no winners. China loses global trust. America loses economic stability. Taiwan loses everything. The real casualty? The world you know, your job, your savings, your future. The real casualty? You mentioned the world we know, jobs and savings. Here is the data-backed reality of that casualty. The global recession estimate suggests a cross-strait conflict could cause a 10% drop in global GDP, dwarfing the impact of the 2008 financial crisis or COVID-19. The technology dark age. If Taiwan's chip production stops, everything from your smartphone and car to medical equipment and power grids would face indefinite shortages. Savings and stability. Financial markets would likely dive as investors flee to safe haven assets, like gold, which recently hit records near $5,600 per ounce due to these very fears. Is there a middle ground? While the rhetoric is sharp, 2026 has also seen a pragmatic shift in some areas. The latest thus national defense strategies has notably softened some language toward China, opting for deterrence by denial rather than unnecessary confrontation. There is a desperate global effort to avoid the no-winners scenario you described. It's a high-stakes game of chicken where the chicken is the entire modern economy. The chip chokehold, why your job is at risk. Taiwan produces over 90% of the world's most advanced semiconductors. These aren't just for iPhones. They are the brains of the modern world. The chain reaction if Taiwan's foundries like Semchi stop. Production lines in Germany, the US, and Japan for cars, medical devices, and industrial machinery stop within weeks. The job loss when factories can't get parts. They furlough workers. A 2026 Bloomberg analysis suggests a full-scale conflict could trigger a $10 trillion hit to global GDP, roughly 10% of the entire world's wealth vanishing overnight. 2. China, the factory of the world versus the blockade. China's strength is also its greatest vulnerability. It is the world's largest exporter, but it is fundamentally dependent on global markets. Economic suicide if the West imposes catastrophic sanctions similar to those on Russia but on a 10x scale. China's export-driven economy would collapse. Estimates suggest a 16.7% contraction in their GDP. Energy hunger. China imports the vast majority of its oil and gas through sea lanes the US Navy controls. A blockade would mean literal lights out for many Chinese industrial hubs, leading to massive internal social unrest. 3. America, the stability mirage. America might be oceans away, but its economy is hardwired into the Pacific. The savings crisis, most 401ks and retirement funds are tied to tech giants Apple, Nvidia, Microsoft. If the Taiwan chip supply is severed, these stocks could lose half their value in days. The inflation bomb. You thought 2022 inflation was bad? A conflict would see import bill shocks where the price of basic electronics and consumer goods doubles or triples because the supply chain is shattered into war blocks. For Taiwan, everything lost. And for Taiwan, this isn't an economic graph, it's an existential one. Physical destruction and invasion would likely destroy the very infrastructure, the silicon shield that makes Taiwan valuable to the world. The aftermath, even if Taiwan wins or holds out, its economy is projected to shrink by 40%. The world's most sophisticated tech hub would become a fortress of ruins. The verdict: a broken world. The current 2026 geopolitical outlook describes a tripolar world where the global economy splits into three. The West Bloc is EU, Japan. The East Bloc, China, Russia, Iran. The neutrals, India, Brazil, ASEAN, struggling to survive the crossfire. This is why, despite the aggressive rhetoric, both Washington and Beijing are currently, as of February 2026, engaged in pragmatic de-risking. They are realizing that you cannot burn down your neighbor's house when you both live in a cardboard mansion. The digital dark cage semiconductors. Taiwan produces 92% of the world's most advanced semiconductors. These aren't just for smartphones. They are the brains of everything from fighter jets and medical MRI machines to the servers that run the global banking system. The loss if Semchi, Taiwan semiconductor manufacturing company, goes offline. Bloomberg Economics estimates a $10 trillion hit to global GDP, or roughly 10% of the world's economy. For context, that is a deeper scar than both the 2008 financial crisis and the COVID-19 pandemic. No quick fix. You cannot simply rebuild a chip plant, a fab, in a few months. A single fab costs upwards of $20 billion and takes years to calibrate. We would be looking at a multi-year global shortage of basically anything with a power button. The choke point of global trade. The Taiwan Strait is one of the world's busiest shipping lanes. The traffic, nearly half of the world's container ships and 88% of the world's largest ships pass through this waterway. The consequence: a blockade or active war zone would force ships to reroute around the Philippines or Australia, skyrocketing insurance premiums and fuel costs. This wouldn't just affect tech, it would disrupt the delivery of food, raw materials, and energy, triggering massive global inflation overnight. The silicon shield versus geopolitical realities. For years, Taiwan's dominance in chips has been called its silicon shield, the idea that the world cannot afford to let Taiwan fall. However, the consequence of that shield being tested is a direct confrontation between the world's two largest nuclear powers, the US and China. Sanctions, unlike Russia, China is the world's factory. Decoupling through sanctions would be like trying to perform surgery on yourself without anesthesia. The supply chains for EV solar panels and pharmaceuticals are so deeply integrated with China that a total break would lead to industrial paralysis in the West. The reality check. Are we prepared? In short, not yet. While the US via the CHIPS Act and the EU are trying to raise chip manufacturing, these projects won't reach full maturity for years. We are currently in a period of maximum vulnerability where the rewind button is most needed but entirely non-existent. So the real question isn't, will China invade Taiwan? The real question is, are we prepared for the consequences if it happens? Because once it starts power, there is no rewind button.